right? It's visual interactive browsing. You can see your components in all their states. It gives you snazzy little controls to control all the props, so you can manually play with the props and see how the component updates. You can generate some basic documentation, but the nice thing is you can create your own documentation through MDX, so fancy Markdown with included components. So your documentation can include the components themselves and how to configure them. They have this notion of pages, which is really just a higher order component that lets you throw a bunch of these components all into one screen, so you'll see how they look. And of course, it supports hot reload, so you can see how everything goes. How the changes you make are reflected. So the nice thing about it is it safely installs into an existing project. So it's not going to. You can have an existing project and it's not going to screw you up. So what I have over here in my VS Code is just a basic scaffolded view app. They give you a dopey Hello World component and an app, some tests, and that's all it is. So if I ran npx storybook init, I'll not make you watch the npm install. What it provides you with is it adds in a configuration subdirectory called .storybook, which just says, how do you find the stories? A story is what defines these different states we want to test. It then creates a stories directory, and they drop in some simple components for you. They give you a button component, a header component, and a page component. So for folks who aren't familiar with Vue, this is what what's known as a single file component looks like. It's Vue 2. Vue 3 supports our more hook-based style development like we were used to in React world. So the basic notion is there's 3 sections. There's the template, so regular HTML template tag. Here we're rendering a button. You can give it a bunch of classes. It has a click handler when you click on it, and you could also give it some styles. And then within the button, it'll render the label. The important part of it is you export an object, and the props define what are the properties that this component can take. So, for example, it takes a label, which is string. It's required. They've defined this guy as you can have a Boolean for whether it's a primary button or not a primary button. It has a notion of size. There's 3 different sizes, and you can set a background color. That's pretty much it. So let's run it. The way you run this guy is you just type yarn storybook. Oops. It's going to be typing always a challenge. Let me see if there's any questions. Howard said, how does Storybook interact with XD? I don't know what XD is. I'm sorry. Just kind of went to sleep here. Oh, and I lost my window I was just looking at. Let me go back there. So I'm sorry. Thank you, Megan. All right, Ernesto. Adobe XD UI. Oh, I have no idea. I've never used Adobe XD. How does it interact with NPM? You don't even need to NPM install it, but you can NPM install it, right? NPX is just says go find it and run it. So you don't have to install it. It saves you from having it in your no modules, but it'll be cached. So if you run it again, it'll always be available. Is there an ugly or paper theme so to focus on function? I would say it's a pretty ugly theme. Let me make this a little bigger. So here's the default view. It's just plain old theme, nothing fancy. Here's our button. And I'll show you how you write these stories in a second, but I just want to give you an idea of what comes out of the box. So if we look at the bottom here, there's these sections. If you click on it, you can see it automatically generates. It tells you, hey, there was a click handler was called. It's got no argument. It gave you no arguments as part of that click. You can play around with the controls manually on here. So you could, it gives you like background color chooser if you wanted to play around with these things. I don't know that these are particularly that useful. It's just a nice feature that if you wanted to play around with, maybe you're worried about wrapping, you could, change the inputs and see how your component reacts to the various inputs. You can toggle on and off things and so on. So that's a nice feature, what they call controls. So buttons are pretty simple, right? We can see there's a bunch of different types. But they give you this free docs feature. Let me take this down a notch here, where it basically goes and renders each of these stories that you define all on one screen. So it gives you a quick and easy view of, here's all the ways the designers of this component thought you might be useful. There'd be maybe many, many permutations, but it's always nice to have a user's design system show you what are the useful sets of props for this component, and that's what this does. Let's look at a more interesting one, like the header component. So our header has two different stories. And some of the other features of this are they give you some different ways to view it. So you can say, what's it look like with a light background? What's it look like with a dark background? Oh, maybe we want to do something to make this actually legible or usable in that mode. They give you a grid so you can just do some visual checking of alignment of things. The one I find most useful is they give you some default targets. So for example, like you might want to revisit this design, right? If you need it to work on a small, and of course they give you the landscape portrait toggle. And I'm pretty sure all this is configurable for, what sizes things are. I haven't typically played with these. We're in a, where I'm using Vue, it's definitely a desktop only kind of app. So we don't have to worry about this stuff. So I think this is a pretty cool little project because there isn't much. It gives you all this functionality, and I'll show you all it takes to define these stories. I think that's the next thing. So here's everything involved in a story. Let's zoom into this a little bit. I think I need to quit Storybook. And the way you'd normally have a project set up in Vue is you'd have a components directory, that has all your different components in it. And then your stories would all just go into a stories directory. So, the styles, if any, would be within the component itself as opposed to a separate file as their examples had. So you could look at either of these windows. It's the same thing. One's bigger than the other. The basic notion is you import the component itself. Right, that's the component you want to write a story for. Then you just you export an object which says, hey, what do you want to call this thing? Right? And this example / button is what makes it render example button. And then each story will be automatically put underneath it. You tell it what component to render, which is the guy you just imported. And then this is all optional. This basically says for any props in your component that are not normal simple ones like string or Boolean, you can give them fancy controls like background color. I want this fancy color control. Or for sizes, I want these fancy different sizes to play with. So you set that up, and then you just define a render function, which takes args and spreads them into the object itself. And then you just write your stories using that template. It's really that simple. So you say, hey, give me a fresh template, name it something like primary, and then you define the args for it, which says, okay, set primary to true. It's this guy here. Set the label, which is required, to button. Then you could do the same thing for our secondary example, which sets the label, but doesn't set primary. And so you just go through, and to create all those button stories, it's really just this little bit of code, is all it takes to define those stories. And so it makes it, I was really impressed by how simple it was to get going with Storybook. There's you just like set your props, and that builds this website for you. So that I think is is really a cool feature of Storybook. I mean, that's its reason for existing. So let's look at a production one. Here's the IBM Carbon Design website. So they've put this out on the web, and you can see they have a gajillion components. Here's their accordion component. The thing that impressed me about this is they're really exploiting the MDX functionality. They have really nice documentation they've written, and they've embedded their components right into it. So this is all generated within Storybook itself, and they use the knobs and things to let you. They create special stories, what they call playgrounds, that let you, play around with the various props and see what they look like. So I thought that's pretty cool. So there's plenty of examples out in the world. I'll post the link to all this so you can see what they look like. So that's the main piece about Storybook. I'm just going to spend a couple more minutes.
That wasn't half an hour.
Okay, well, I talked pretty fast. Is anyone confused? Okay, what's the data source for the story? I'll answer questions. Yes, Joe, it is a lot more impressive because like the 5.0 was not nearly as nice as the 6.0 version. They made a lot of improvements to it.
So I was going to ask you if like this was a huge leap forward or if they've been incrementally getting better, because this is like head and shoulders above the last time I looked at it.
I only used the 5.4 or whatever, like a month or two before 6.0 came out. And I just noticed that the whole actions controls thing is now comes pre-wired in. It used to be all separate add-ons you'd have to apply yourself. And now they actually are owning those third parties.
Yeah, they used to call those knobs?
It was knobs, yes. It used to be called knobs. So now they're controls because they're not just knobs.
So if I can ask one more thing. So I'm seeing these like one-to-one, like, on color, you get this groovy color thing. Size is string or an array of strings, so you're getting that. And Boolean, does it also, like, what if you're passing in like a JSON object or something? Does it have controls for that, or does it just give you like a text area?
It gives you a text area.
Okay.
That's as close as it comes that I know of. I'm not an expert. Like I said, I've only used this ever so recently. So I am not an expert by any stretch. Thomas Nielsen asks, what's the data source for the story? The data source is really just the arcs. This isn't a real fancy. The whole notion of Storybook is really just play with, supply different props to put the component into the different states. So I would use this. I'm using this where I'm at now to work with I want to work with a designer on this, so they don't have to be able to run the whole app. I'd like to be able to give them, here's all the components. Can you help me get these all styled in a meaningful way that looks like they're components that were designed by the same person? And they all interact. They all have the same callbacks. The naming conventions are all the same. The margins, the padding, all the UI, UX is the same. And that's the beauty of this, is you could just give your code base to a designer or a UX pro, and they could either build it for you or fix it for you. And that's why. So, yeah, I'd give it, or the designer would give a clue to me, right? As a dev, I may be like, I need a button. What do I do? And they could design components for me, who's writing the app. Can you have? Go ahead.
I was going to say, just expand on that a little bit, because it was not clear to me what is the point of Storybook.
Oh, the point of Storybook is in some ways this view to me. That's this view.
So it's an MDS system. It builds an MDS system.
I want to use. I'm building an application. Within my application, we've written some of our own components, right? Not everyone uses third-party components. A lot of people roll their own components, or they may have some custom ones. So this is like a cheap and easy way to give documentation to devs on your team that says, hey, these are components we've already got. Don't go out and roll your own button. We've got a button, and here's examples of how to use it, right? And you don't have to be a documenter, right? It just comes out of writing code that is trivial to write for developers. And I would argue you would want to write these anyway, because you probably should have unit tests, or at least snapshot tests for all of these. Okay, can you have each example linked directly to the code that creates it being shown, or do you have to use the docs tab to handle that? It depends where the source is. Like here, this is something that I think is a problem with the Vue version of Storybook, is that it doesn't give you a very useful view of the template. Like I'd want it to say what the actual args are, and they basically just show you the same code for each one. And I think for React, it does the right thing. It shows you the actual args, but I could be wrong on that.
But
so, because what you'd like to just be able to go copy and paste.
Right.
That's
the other thing is I noticed because they showed it in docs here, but you have to kind of write this out in MDX. I'm assuming it's not really the example itself that you would be able to just see the code for. And so just one thing to note is, like, one of my experiences with this has been whenever I look at the examples, I end up having to dig through their code to find the example code. And it's usually written in such a dry way that it is totally useless to actually copy. So it's just a comment. I wasn't sure because this looks really different to what I've seen in the past. So I wasn't sure if they had improved on that a little bit.
Yeah, that's an area I want to look into, since there's only a couple of us on my team who are going to be using this. It's not a big deal. But yeah, if you were going to really want this usable for a bunch of people, it'd be nice to have, examples like this where you can just say copy, paste. So it's like Bootstrap, right? When we used to use Bootstrap for everything, you just go to the website, copy, paste. It was the beauty of it,
What do you mean used to?
Okay.
And what do you mean beauty?
Yeah. Everything should be a beautiful snowflake, handcrafted with custom CSS everywhere. When we say components, do we mean controls? So it allows you to build custom control library. I think a component is a more generic thing of a control, because in my view. But yes, you could call it controls, definitely. Okay, now I'm taking real time. So the other thing I just want to show, hopefully quickly, is, hey, there's no reason you can't use these stories to drive other useful things, like unit tests, right? So I could create a unit test, and using like JavaScript testing library, like all the cool kids do for Jest, you just import your stories. This is the part I don't like so far, and I'm hoping it's just a Vueism, is I have to import the actual component under test also. I think I should be able to get away with just importing that, but whatever. But then you basically render it, and you pass off the props right out of your story, right? So you have these predefined stories, just jam them into the props, and then you can just render them. Once they're rendered, you can do all your assertions against the component. So it makes it really simple to write basic tests against it. So you could see if stuff blows up. And I think, I didn't check this in, but of course you could also fire off the events too, and confirm that they actually work. So you can write a bunch of tests against your stories, because supposedly these stories represent use cases of each of the components. The other one that might be useful, that people might find useful, is snapshot testing. A lot of people are either hating on or loving snapshot testing. Snapshot testing, I think at the component level, is probably semi-useful. You could detect if your HTML or classes have rendered differently. So you can just write just snapshots, right? You could just, do whatever, what is it? Container. Forget it. I won't type it out. It's like container match snapshot or something like that to just enter it in. But they have this cool plugin called Story Shots. And once you install it, all you have to do is create a new unit test where you import this guy and you init it. And what it does is it, just like Storybook does, it rips through all your stories and generates snapshots for them all. Right? So you run it like you would run your tests. Yeah. So it picks up our spec, it runs it, and we now have a snapshots directory. And so here, for example, is our primary test. It renders out the HTML that would render it for that story based on those props. Same thing for our secondary button. And so if you ever make future changes to these components, the snapshot would detect any diffs in the generated HTML. Another test that's semi-interesting is the accessibility testing using Axe. The Axe project, I haven't used it before, but it's basically just some real simple accessibility tests. Once you install it as a plugin, you don't actually have to do anything to your apps at all. Let me not save that. I think I need to rerun Storybook. And once it's done building, I like how it keeps trying to pop open the wrong window of my browser. We get this new accessibility dude here, and it basically just does some super simple tests like, is there text rendered that a screen reader can find? If you use an ID, is it unique? That's worth something. And then the interesting one is it checks contrast. So that actually is useful. So, I could go into my buttoned style because it's basically saying my background for my primary button is lame. Come on. Oh, come on. There we go. Let's make it a darker color. Save it. And it should rebuild. The only thing I've noticed of this is it doesn't redo the accessibility until you change the tab away. That's the only gotcha on it. It doesn't know about hot reloading that. So now I have no violations, all my accessibility stuff tests. And you could see how fast that was, right? So you could imagine being as a developer, monkeying around with your component here, and it's going to, automatically update as you, make changes to the component. You'll see the changes instantly on the screen. So it means you don't have to have a fancy setup to make life work. So that is pretty much what I want to cover. They also have a product called Chromatic, which does visual regression testing. So it actually does, in a browser, screenshots of every story and diffs the bits, to make sure they haven't changed over time. And this is a paid for product. So I'll post this up here. There's the Learning Storybook website, which is really good. They have a thing, Design Systems for Developers, which I think is really nice if you want to learn about design systems. And I'll post these guys up there. So sorry, I'm sure I went way over, but
no, that's bang on 30 minutes.
Woo!
Yeah, this is really good. This is I have to go check all this stuff out. I always thought Axe, which I also haven't really used, but I know some people swear by. I always thought it was like something you run after you produce your bundles and run them in the browser or something like that. It's neat to see it like running on individual components.
And it looks, I haven't looked very hard at this, but there's a jest version of it, so you can just do assertions on all these things, I think, too. So it could just be a unit test. Because the bummer of this is if you wanted to actually, you're not going to go through all these views and check the accessibility tab. But while you're developing a component, hey, that's pretty cool that it just shows you, have you got a bad color? But then once it's in your unit test, life is, then it's locked in. Oh, sorry, I missed a story there. Question there. Is storyboarding the same as storyboard? Well, this is Storybook. Storyboarding is more the notion of drawing out either electronically or on paper, kind of the flow through various pages or through workflows. That's my understanding of storyboarding. And a wireframe might be a picture within a storybook, within a storyboard, I mean. So a story here is really literally just the state of a component based on its props. This is all a story is. It just says, render me a button with a label named button. It's really, to me, the beauty of this is it's a targeted, simple tool. It's not trying to do too much. It does a real lot with very little, but it's also not trying to do too much.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that they're, I mean, at least the plugin ecosystem is doing so much with testing. I again, having looked at it quite a while back, I remember thinking, like hearing people say like, oh, you can do testing with Storybook, and it never looked this good. I mean, it's maybe it's still got a ways to go, but it's
not going to let you
compelling.
write, crazy ass tests with back end data, but you're writing tests against components, right? So that's what it's good for what it's good for.
Well, I think I remember it being like more complicated. The idea that you can pull those stories into a regular unit test, I think is a really good like separation of the two. So you're not tied to Storybook, but if these stories are already there, you can just pull them in and treat them like a configuration.
Exactly.
So that's really cool.
So I have a random question for you, Steve. So you framed this from the perspective of you being able to hand this to a designer and say, please style my stuff.
Well, I mean, that's the lame way I might do it, because we have a bunch of existing components. Right. But I think the more likely case is you're the developer of these components and you probably have more design chops than I do. And so you would actually
so let's say
not be handing it off to anyone. You would be the owner.
Let's say we're doing this at a large level, like enterprise wide. Is this a way, I think you alluded to it, to distribute the right way to build all of your components for the enterprise system, including all the tests that you should use and assert during your development? Is it a distribution model as well?
It's a distribution model in that you could distribute, here's what we've got and here's how to use it. It's kind of not solving the problem you're talking about, though. Right. So it's more like, hey, within the company, these are the blessed components, and here's how you should use them. If you think you need to make your own date picker, you should look at this one first before you start rolling out.
No. Enterprises go, if you need a date picker, this is the one you're going to use.
Well, because you were kind of asking, would you use this as a way to say how to write tests or how to do it?
Yeah.
It would only be if you wrote special docs and just happened to host them here. It's not really its goal in life.
Okay.
Its goal is really to help you build things and share them with your team. Cool. Okay. Thanks, gang. I'll figure out how to unshare my screen now.